My labor and delivery story. Wow. My labor and delivery was absolutely crazy. It lasted 26 hours. When my baby was born, he was not breathing. He was blue, completely limp. It was very chaotic and scary and crazy the first long few minutes of his life. Hi guys, so I am back to do another video, and today's video is going to be my labor and delivery story. And it was a very crazy, hectic few days. I was actually in the hospital for 5 days. I did end up getting induced. It was technically an emergency induction because my fluid levels around the baby, the fluid around the baby was pretty low, so I did have to go to the hospital to be induced. And that all happened on Monday, March 15th. That's when it all started. So I had a doctor's appointment that morning, and that is when she measured the fluid around the baby, and it was measuring at 3 centimeters, and the fluid around your baby should be at 5 centimeters. So she recommended me to go be induced. Like I've said in all of my other videos, I do not like my doctor, so I was very hesitant about being induced. I didn't want to be induced, and I didn't not want to be induced because of the potential risk, but because I didn't believe her and I didn't trust her, and I really wanted a second opinion. Also, when I got my ultrasound that morning to measure the fluid, the ultrasound tech said that she was going to tweak the numbers so that they were lower so that I would have to be induced, which is complete bullshit to me, and it was just a very weird day. So that appointment was around noon on the 15th, and my doctor did call the hospital and tell them that I was coming, so they had a room ready for me and everything, and I actually decided that I wasn't gonna go. And so around 3 p.m. my doctor's office called me because the hospital had called them asking where I was because they had a room ready for me, and I told her that I decided that I was not going to go. And I'm not sure who she is, I think she's a nurse at my doctor's office. She talked to me and kind of reassured me a little. So my boyfriend and I decided to go to the hospital, but we wanted to do a few things around the house first. We actually wanted to go get some donuts, so we didn't end up going to the hospital until around 9 p.m. on that Monday. So we get to the hospital, go to the emergency room, do all that fun stuff. We get checked in, and everything started. Around 11 p.m. midnight, they induced me, and I'm not sure if it's the same everywhere, but the way they induced me is they put a little tiny pill, I believe, up my veg. They put it up there and it ripens your cervix, and usually that will be in for a few hours, and then they need to start you on Pitocin to get contractions going. I was on that, it's called Cervidil. The Cervidil was in for about 7 to 8 hours, which to me felt like 2 to 3 hours. And I think it's because I tried to sleep, because again, it was around midnight when everything started to happen. And when I say start to happen, contractions didn't start. None of that started, just the IV was going, the induction had begun. And so I did try sleeping, and I think I got a few hours in because, like I said, I thought it was only 2 to 3 hours, but my boyfriend said that it was 7 to 8 hours of me going through labor before it was too much for me. So those 7 to 8 hours, my contractions had started, everything was picking up, and my contractions actually got to 1 minute to 2 minutes apart. So they were very, very intense. It was very uncomfortable. They hurt. Contractions are not a joke, and that's obvious, but it was really, really crazy. I actually started throwing up with every contraction I had. So every 1 to 2 minutes I was throwing up. So that was really intense. And at that point I had decided I wanted to get an epidural. And the nurse had come in and said my contractions were way too close together and I was only 2 centimeters dilated. So to have contractions 1 to 2 minutes apart and be only 2 centimeters dilated, my body was doing way too much, way too fast, and not really progressing. So she decided to take that pill out and see if I would progress on my own, but I still wanted to get an epidural. I was having my contractions and I told her I wanted an epidural, and it was not easy because you have to stay still. You can't move when you have this giant needle going into your back. But when you're having such bad contractions, you need to move and get into comfortable positions, and it was really hard for me not to move. But what the nurse did is she sat in front of me at the edge of my bed, and I kind of hugged her, like did a weird hug thing around her, and she held me. My boyfriend sat next to me, which I heard a lot of hospitals don't allow your partner to be in the room when you get an epidural, but he was right there. The only thing the nurse said was that he cannot be behind me. He wasn't allowed to see anything that was happening behind me, so he had to sit in front of me. And I think that's because a lot of partners freak out or pass out because the needle of an epidural is so big, and what they do back there is really invasive and really intense, so they don't want your partner to see. But he was allowed in the room. He just had to sit in front of me, which he did. The epidural is a whole other story. But long story short, he put the needle in, or what I assume had to be the tube that ran the epidural through, and when he put it in, it veered to the right, and I felt it veer to the right, and it was the most painful thing. I did squirm. The nurse told me not to move, and I told her it wasn't a contraction, it was me feeling the needle. And the anesthesiologist asked me where I felt it. I told him I felt it veering to the right, so he pulled it out, one again, and then it veered to the left, and I felt it veer to the left, and I told him no, it's going to the left, so he took it out again and did it again, and he got it. And after that, he did ask me if, I forgot his exact phrasing. I forgot the exact phrasing he used, but it was something along the lines of, did anyone ever tell you you have a curved back? It was something like that. But I guess he was saying that my back is kind of curved, and that's why the tube or the needle veered to the right and to the left. So that was intense. But after that, it was super chill. I just hung out.
About how many gods do you have? Like hundreds, I think.
Obviously didn't feel anything. My left leg ended up being a complete dead leg. Couldn't move it, couldn't feel it, nothing. My right leg, I still had a good amount of feeling in, so I was able to move it in different positions, but my left leg was no. Let me just say really quick that the nurses are so amazing. I cannot stress enough how amazing these nurses were. So into the middle of my labor, got my epidural, was just hanging out. I wasn't able to eat anything, and that was awful because, like I said, I had thrown up everything in the beginning of my labor. So not being able to eat anything was really hard, but the nurse was able to get me some Jell-O, some popsicles, and that was all I lived on for that entire part of labor, which was close to 12 hours. That was just the whole day of me hanging out with my epidural and going through labor. And my body did end up progressing after the pill was taken out, so I didn't need Pitocin, so I was just going through labor naturally on my own after I got the epidural and after my doctor took that pill out, or the nurse took the pill out. So in the middle of all of that, watched a bunch of Harry Potter, watched a bunch of Office, just hung out and waited for things to get started. Now, when things did start getting started, my water did end up breaking. I had no idea. I didn't feel it because can't feel anything. The nurse came and checked and my water did break, but she said that there was still a sack of water. So she called in a doctor to come break that water, and that is what he did. He came and broke the remaining half of whatever water was still in there, and then everything did start getting a little more intense. My epidural started to wear off, and that's of course when my nurse said it was time to do some practice pushes, but the practice pushes ended up being real pushes, and everything started happening. And I actually ended up pushing for 2 hours, almost 3 hours, so 2 hours and 50 minutes I was pushing for. Again, it did not feel like that at all. It felt like I was pushing for an hour, but I started pushing at 11 p.m. My baby was born at 1:50 a.m., so I pushed that entire time, and it was terribly painful because, like I said, my epidural had worn off. I could feel everything. The worst part was my back pain and all the pressure that was in my back. That was really uncomfortable, and again, intense. Intense is just gonna be the key word for this video. And so I did my pushing. The doctor came in when I had maybe 10 to 20 minutes of pushing left, and I was pushing, and you have the monitors strapped to your belly, one measuring your contractions, one measuring your baby's heart rate, and as you push, the nurse moves them down because the baby's moving down. And when I was very close to delivering, my baby's heart stopped, and they told me I needed to push like my life depended on it, because it did. So I pushed like crazy to get the baby out because he had no heartbeat, and he was born at 1:50 a.m. on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. He was not breathing. He was completely blue and still, and at that point probably 8 nurses and doctors rushed in to resuscitate him. They were doing CPR, they were shoving tubes down his throat. He was not crying, he was completely silent. All the doctors and nurses were over there trying to get him to cry, trying to get any movement from him, and they were getting no responses from him, no response. And I remember so clearly that at 1:57, one of the nurses said, stopping compressions at 1:57. And we thought he was dead because she said stopping compressions 1:57. He was not dead, but that was probably the scariest thing I have ever heard. And eventually they did get him to start crying, and he started screaming, and it was amazing. And the reason why the nurse said that is so that they can record that, they stopped compressions. It didn't mean anything else. It was just for the record, but it was awful. It was terrible. At around 2 o'clock, a little after 2 o'clock, he did start breathing. He was pink, he had a heartbeat. All the nurses and doctors saved his life. And the reason why that happened was because, my water broke. The doctor came, broke the rest of my water. But what they didn't notice was there was a giant sack of water around his face. And when I was pushing him, you know, those last few pushes, he inhaled all of that water and essentially he drowned. So they had to suck all the water out, get his heart going again, give him CPR, and it was just really crazy. And that is why we had to be in the hospital for 5 days, because for the first 2 days he was monitored in the special care nursery. It wasn't the NICU, it was a level below the NICU, and he had to be in that area to be monitored, so he wasn't in the room with us. We weren't able to be with him, but I did go back and forth because I wanted to breastfeed him, so I was in and out of that room every few hours breastfeeding him, hanging out with him. My boyfriend was in there hanging out with him, and then eventually he did come back into our room. We were allowed to have him. He was doing a lot better. And on Friday, March 19th, we finally left the hospital after being there for 5 days. And we were able to take him home, and he is good and healthy and perfect. And we are very, very lucky to have him. His name is Maximus, or just Max. And that is my crazy labor and delivery story. That is all for this video, and I will see you for my next video.